Royal Liverpool Hospital, may I help you?
You want bleep 152 or 154? Royal Liverpool Hospital, can I help you?
Traditional way a hospital looked at of ours, if we take the most junior doctors or the ward cover, is a provisionally registered house officer wandering the wards at night on their own. What they're doing is directed entirely by their bleep. It's written down onto a scrap of paper, and the order in which those tasks are carried out is entirely determined by who yelled loudest at them when they were called, or has bleeped them so many times repeatedly that it's easier to go and deal with that patient next. It's not about clinical orders of priority, and many of the tasks they're carrying out are entirely inappropriate to their level of skill. What we've moved to is a situation where the senior nursing staff on and the PRHOs and SHOs are very much a team caring for the wards under the direction of a senior nurse and the medical registrar usually, but a senior doctor working in conjunction with each other. What you've then got is the right person going to carry out that task in a clinically appropriate time order and a logical sequence. And the feedback we've got, particularly from the most junior doctors, is they feel far less isolated before, and they feel that the hospital is much safer than it used to be. The key to the Hospital at Night project is to change the way we work out of hours in hospitals so that we provide better care for the patients using, for many hospitals, fewer staff and using more appropriate staff, determining who's there based on competency. The hospitals are much quieter at night than they are in the evening. Indeed, the evening period from 5 o'clock till about 11 is the hospital's busiest period for emergency workload. And the activity at 5 o'clock in the morning is a quarter that of 5 o'clock in the evening. And yet, outside A&E and anaesthetics, most departments staff hospitals as 9 to 5 and everything else. What we need to do is to boost the numbers available during that evening period to deal with that workload more appropriately, then it doesn't spill over into the night and you can safely have a skeleton staff, if you like, on at night to cope with routine levels of work. Now what we're trying to do is to have that work done by more appropriate staff. This is not about dumping work onto others. This is about team working. It's about empowering staff to carry out functions they're perfectly capable and happy to do, but at the moment, rather sort of patronising, you have to ask permission from a doctor. And to have any nursing staff having to ask permission to give a patient an analgesic that the patient could buy from Tesco's or Sainsbury's is daft. 19,000 episodes of care were looked at across 11 trusts in the out-of-hours period. And what we found is something that any of the resident doctors will tell you. At night, doctors work in silos. They don't talk to each other. The challenge for the inpatient teams is how few patients can they admit through the door, and everybody's aim is to say no. What we've changed is to an ethos where people say yes, where it's transparently clear that a patient may need to come into hospital. There must be some sort of discussion about who is the most appropriate team or most appropriate person to admit them, of course. But you have that group of a dozen or so doctors working together in the patient's best interest. The other aspect is best illustrated by an example of a young girl who came into the A&E department where I was working at one of the pilot sites with an acute abdomen. And the A&E SHO clerked her. She has an acute abdomen. She's clinically unwell, asked me to come and see her, and I saw her. She did indeed have an acute abdomen. She needed to see a surgeon. And so a surgeon was called, and the surgical PRHO came down to see her. Surgical PRHO said, yes, she has an acute abdomen. She's quite unwell. I will get my SHO. The SHO came down to see her and goes, God, she has an acute abdomen. And called his registrar. And the registrar came down and examined the patient and said, she does indeed have an acute abdomen, but it could be gynae. So he called the gynae SHO. The gynae SHO comes down and goes, gosh, she's got an acute abdomen. I must call my registrar. And the gynae registrar comes down, she goes, she's got an acute abdomen. I agree, but it could be surgical. And so the two of them end up having a discussion, it goes up to the consultant to have a discussion, and eventually, 5 hours after she comes in, that patient gets taken to theatre. Some repeat clerkings benefit our learning, but 5 hours of morphine dripped into you in an A&E department is not in the patient's best interest.
I think there's a much greater coordination of what's going on within the hospital. I, as the team leader, am aware of the sickest patients now when I come on duty. It means I can follow them up and try and head off problems before they arise almost, rather than reacting to them when often they're an hour or two down the line. From a patient care point of view, I think that is miles better and must be the way forward.
The main change with the hospital at night, for the house officers in particular, is the bleep filtering. Before we had bleep filtering, before we had hospital at night, we would be bleeped directly from the wards by the staff for a range of different tasks, whereas now it goes through a senior support sister. The senior support sister's job would be to actually filter the bleeps using their experience and decide whether or not it needed a doctor to attend, or whether it could be dealt with by themselves, or perhaps if a medical assistant could do the job, such as if it was cannulation, venipuncture, or even catheterisation. That basically, from our point of view, leaves us with a bit more time to deal with the iller patients and to put the management plans into process, rather than getting bleeped away from all these things to do minor tasks. It was a worry of most of the house officers that the nurses would in fact just do our job. We were worried that they would cherry pick things and we'd be left with the run-of-the-mill chart rewriting, etc. But I think we're very happy, really. It hasn't actually happened. It means that you're not as stressed in many ways. I think a lot of my colleagues and myself to some extent get very stressed by multiple bleeps, and before hospital at night you could be bleeped perhaps 2 or 3 times, maybe more, by the same ward for the same job. A little job, for instance, putting a cannula in, which when you're dealing with someone who's got perhaps a life-threatening emergency is very, very stressful, because you keep being called away from that problem, whereas now it doesn't happen. One of the main things about hospital at night is the handover. Now, before hospital at night was introduced, we'd have an informal handover, perhaps in the mess or over the telephone, whereby the doctor coming on would phone the doctor going off. We thought that was very reasonable, and we were quite resistant to the change. The change being that the handover is formalised, and in this hospital we have handover, 2 handovers, a medical and a surgical, due to the size of the hospital and the size of the teams. It's basically a good thing, because you get a heads up on the poorly patients and you are expecting the bleep from the ward rather than being cold bleeps, if you will, and suddenly having to look through a lot of notes when someone is potentially dying.
We have 2 handovers at night when we come on night duty. We have a handover from the surgical team on days and the support sisters on days, and then we have a medical handover following that. So, the junior doctors know what night sisters are on duty. They have our bleep numbers, and we work very, very closely together. We all know what's going on in the hospital. We all identify the poorly patients, and we all know what we're doing, and it works really well. We don't go onto the ward and take over the nurse's role on the ward. We go in and assist the nurses. When they identify a poorly patient, we go in and steer them in the right direction, who should be involved, what doctors should be involved with that patient, and speed that care up, because many times we're transferring these patients to high dependency unit, to intensive care unit, or the post-op critical care unit. And it's nice to be able to go in and work alongside the junior doctor and get the patient seen to very quickly, rather than sitting there deteriorating. So it's great to be able to move that along quickly. and we have the power and the support to do so. Filtering the junior doctors' bleeps, there might have been some resistance to that initially because normally the nurses would bleep the doctors themselves. Now we filter the bleep, so the nurse has to come through us for the junior doctor. So there was some resistance, but with good communication between us and the nurses, they understand now what it's about, and they know that they will get whatever they want. If it's the doctor or if it's some task that we can do, we will go there immediately and do it. It's the way forward, and it's a really exciting time for nurses to develop their skills further.
There are some very simple things hospitals can do that yield a significant saving for relatively little effort. Getting test results back earlier. It's no more effort to do that. Either, for example, INR results coming back during the daytime, so warfarin is prescribed by the team who first saw the patient. Mobile phones, by bringing mobile phones into hospitals to replace all but the crash call bleeps. You then end up with the ability for text messaging, saving huge amounts of time. Not only do you know what the task is, you know where you're required and how urgent it is, and you don't have to interrupt what you're doing now to find out what the next job is. Better still, you can use that phone to communicate without looking for one that isn't being used by somebody else, and you can use it while moving from one place to another. It's changing the way staff work. So the dozen or so doctors you have in your hospital out of hours, if they work together and together with the nursing staff as a team in the out of hours period, providing common care that's in the best interest of patients in the hospital, the patients get much better care, they get better training, and the job becomes much more satisfying to do. It is a win-win for everybody.